All right, so today we're diving into something pretty different.
Yeah, definitely off the beaten path.
We've got this document just called Jack's Unified Field.pdf.
Straight and to the point, huh?
No dates, handwritten, and we have absolutely no idea who this Jack is.
Mysterious.
Yeah, and what makes it even more interesting is, well, it's an attempt to define a unified field theory.
Big topic.
Huge, but, and here's the thing, it's not presented in any kind of traditional scientific way.
Right, this is not your typical physics paper.
Definitely not. It's like a mix of physics and almost like metaphysics.
Yeah, it's got this philosophical layer woven into it. It's fascinating.
So where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, Jack starts by defining a whole bunch of new terms, things like impinging fields, adjacent fields.
Okay, hold on a sec. I'm already lost. Those aren't exactly terms you'd find in a physics textbook.
You got that right, and it gets even wilder. We've got solar fields, galactic fields.
There's more?
Oh yeah, even transgalactic fields.
So Jack's basically creating their own, like, cosmic map.
It sees that way, too.
Okay, but how do we make sense of any of this? How do these fields, whatever they are, actually work in Jack's theory?
Well, it's like imagining the universe as this constantly changing energy landscape.
Okay, so far so good.
These areas of energy, those are what Jack calls fields, and they're in constant flux, sort of like waves,
Yeah.
always changing, morphing, interacting, and they exist at different energy levels.
Okay, I'm following.
But here's the catch. They're constantly degrading.
So everything is like breaking down. Doesn't sound very optimistic.
Well, not necessarily. The way Jack explains it is that these fields, even though they're degrading, they can still exist,
Yeah.
but by forming new combinations.
Oh, I see. So it's like a constant process of, I don't know, like cosmic recycling.
That's a great way to put it. Like, imagine Legos, right?
Yeah.
You build something, then you break it apart, then you can build something new.
I like that analogy.
And that seems to be how Jack views these fields, constantly changing, degrading, but always forming something new.
Okay, so that's the basic idea of the fields. But what about all those terms we mentioned earlier, like impinging or adjacent fields? What do they mean in this Lego universe?
Right, so impinging fields, those are the ones that directly influence, directly impact a given field.
So like external forces shaping things from the outside.
Exactly. They're the things that impact and shape a field from outside of it.
So if we try to apply this to our own lives, an impinging field could be, I don't know, like a major life event.
Yeah, something that really shakes things up, forces you to change.
Right, exactly. Like a challenge that forces us to adapt and grow.
That's a great connection.
Okay, so what about adjacent fields? Those sound even more mysterious.
These are interesting. These are the fields that exist just beyond our perception, sort of like undiscovered countries on a map.
So they're out there, but we can't see them yet.
Exactly. They're beyond our current understanding, our current experience.
So is encountering these adjacent fields what expands our consciousness, according to Jack?
That seems to be the idea, yeah. Think of it like, the saying, travel broadens the mind.
Yeah, of course.
Well, Jack's theory seems to suggest there's an actual, like a scientific basis for that.
I like that.
By experiencing new things, encountering these adjacent fields, we stretch our perception. We make our internal map of reality bigger.
That makes sense.
It's all about expanding our horizons, literally and figuratively.
This is starting to come together, but there's one big piece missing, the general field.
Ah, yes, that's where things get really interesting. That's where Jack takes a leap into some pretty deep waters.
This is where we get into the really heady stuff.
Yeah, Jack actually equates the general field with total consciousness.
Whoa, okay, slow down. Total consciousness, what does that even mean?
It's like the sum of all awareness, all experience across the entire universe.
It's like a universal consciousness, like everything is connected on some level.
Yeah, exactly, a mind-blowing concept, right?
It's a lot to take in, and it gets even more complex. Jack says our individual consciousness, like yours and mine, it's just a tiny subset of this general field.
Right, limited by our own ability to perceive, to experience.
So we're all like little whirlpools in this giant ocean of total consciousness.
A beautiful way to put it, yeah. It's like we're all connected to this vast network of awareness, but we only experience a tiny fraction of it.
Okay, so if we're all connected to this general field, does that mean expanding our consciousness like we were talking about? Does that mean we're tapping into it more deeply, merging with these adjacent fields?
That's a really interesting question, and that question takes us right to the heart of Jack's theory.
So how do we do that? How do we expand our awareness according to Jack?
Yeah, Jack actually outlines specific methods for achieving this, for tapping into this greater awareness.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What are these methods? How do we actually do this according to Jack?
That's what we're going to explore next. So before the break, we were talking about how expanding our consciousness means, well, basically encountering those adjacent fields, those areas of experience just outside of what we normally perceive. How do we actually do that?
Yeah, because it's one thing to talk about expanding our awareness, but how do we actually make that happen? Does Jack give us any practical advice?
Well, he does outline three ways, three main methods for expanding consciousness. And the first one is fairly straightforward. He calls it recombining existing experiences.
So that sounds like reflecting on the past, sort of looking for new connections and insights in the things we've already experienced, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like taking all the Lego bricks you've got and
Yeah.
seeing what new things you can build with them. But Jack doesn't just stop there. He also talks about encountering an impinging field.
Right, those external forces that shape our reality. So is he saying we need to actively look for challenges, like go out and find obstacles to overcome?
Well, you could see it that way, but I think the point is that sometimes those impinging fields, they come to us whether we want them to or not. Life throws curveballs, and those experiences, even though they can be difficult, those experiences can force us to grow in ways we never thought possible.
Makes sense. It's like those challenges, they push us outside our comfort zones, make us see things in a new light. But what about the third method? Encountering an adjacent field.
Now, this is where things get really interesting. Jack suggests that encountering an adjacent field is all about stepping into the unknown, experiencing something totally new. It could be traveling to a new place, learning a new skill, or even just, having a conversation with someone with very different views.
So basically expanding our horizons, literally and figuratively. But those kinds of experiences, they can be a little scary, can't they? Stepping into the unknown, challenging our own beliefs, that takes courage.
Definitely. And Jack seems to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
He doesn't pretend that expanding your consciousness is always easy or comfortable,
Mhm.
but he implies that, well, it's worth the risk, worth the effort.
Okay, so we've talked about the methods, but there's this other part of Jack's theory that we need to talk about, this idea of magical field theory. And this is where things get a little unconventional.
Yeah, magical field theory. This is where Jack goes beyond, I'd say beyond the typical scientific framework and into, well, you could call it the metaphysical.
Right, because magical field theory, it's not just about observing reality, it's about, like, actually influencing it, right? It seems like Jack is saying our consciousness has this power to shape events in the world around us.
Yeah, that's the core of it, this idea that our perception shapes reality and our conscious will can actually influence events. Think about it. You're about to do something simple, like picking up a glass of water. That action, it always starts with a mental act, an intention to pick up the glass.
So our thoughts are like setting the stage for our actions.
Yeah, exactly. And Jack takes this idea even further, suggesting that this principle, it doesn't just apply to, physical actions, but to a much wider range of phenomena. He says that through focused intention, through visualization, we can influence events in the world we experience.
Okay, now I see where the magical part comes in. But isn't this getting into like wishful thinking? I mean, if I just visualize something hard enough, will it like magically appear?
Well, that's a good question. And it's something Jack addresses.
Yeah.
He knows that this whole magical field theory thing,
Mm.
it might be met with some skepticism, especially from people who think strictly scientifically.
So how does Jack deal with that skepticism? I mean, does he offer any proof to back up this theory?
Well, not in the traditional way, not with experimental data or anything like that. Instead, Jack uses thought experiments, analogies to get his point across.
Can you give us an example, one of those thought experiments? I'm really curious how Jack tries to explain this magical influence on reality.
Okay, sure. One of the things Jack talks about is how even scientific observation, the way scientists observe things, even that is shaped by consciousness. He argues that our perception, the lens we use to view the world, it inevitably colors our interpretation of data and shapes our understanding of reality.
So even science, which we usually think of as objective, unbiased, even that is filtered through our own individual consciousness.
Exactly. And that raises some really big questions about the nature of reality itself. If what we see is influenced by our perception, how can we be sure we're ever seeing the world as it truly is?
That's a pretty mind-blowing thought. It makes you wonder how much of what we call reality is actually just, created by our own minds. But how does Jack tie this idea, this perception shaping reality? How does he connect that back to magical field theory?
Well, he argues that if our consciousness influences our perception and our perception shapes reality, then, well, then it stands to reason that our consciousness has at least some influence over the world around us.
Okay, I can see how Jack is building this argument, but it's still a big jump, to go from influencing our perception to actually shaping events in the outside world. Does Jack address that at all?
He does. And this is where the idea of the general field comes back in, that universal consciousness we were talking about earlier. Jack suggests that our individual consciousness, even though it seems separate, is actually a part of this much larger interconnected web of awareness.
So we're all connected, like nodes in a giant network. But how does that connection give us this power to influence things outside of our own experience?
That's a question Jack leaves open for us to think about. He doesn't give a definitive answer, but he hints at the possibility that our thoughts, our intentions, our emotions, when they're focused, when they're amplified through this connection to the general field, that they could have this ripple effect on the world around us.
So our individual consciousness, it's like a drop of water in this vast ocean. On its own, it might not seem like much, but when it's connected to that larger body of water, it can contribute to waves, to currents that can span the entire ocean.
That's a really great analogy, and it underscores, I think, the core message of Jack's theory, that everything is connected, and that our individual consciousness, even though it might seem small, insignificant even, it has the potential to affect the world in ways that we might not even understand.
This is a lot to digest, but there's one part I'm still trying to understand. Jack lays out all these different concepts, like the nature of fields, this general field of consciousness, magical field theory, but does he ever try to put them all together, like into a unified whole?
That's a great question, and it takes us to the heart of Jack's work.
Sure.
And, well, he does try to show how all these pieces fit together.
So how does he do it? How does Jack connect all these seemingly different ideas?
Well, he starts by drawing parallels between the way fields behave and the way consciousness works. Remember we talked about fields constantly degrading and recombining to survive?
Right, the cosmic recycling program.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Jack suggests that consciousness works in a similar way. Our experiences, our thoughts, our memories, they're always changing, rearranging, forming new connections.
So our consciousness is like a dynamic system always in motion, just like those fields we talked about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And Jack suggests that this constant interplay, this dynamic process of things breaking down and rebuilding, that's what allows us to grow, to learn, to expand our awareness.
Okay, I see how that fits. But how does magical field theory fit in? If our consciousness is always changing, how can we have any lasting influence on the world?
That's where the general field comes back in. Jack argues that our individual consciousness, even though it's in constant flux, is also connected to this larger universal consciousness.
Right, that interconnected web we talked about before.
Exactly. And Jack seems to suggest that through this connection to the general field, our intentions, our visualizations, they can gain, well, a kind of momentum, a power that goes beyond our own limited sphere of influence.
So it's like tapping into a universal energy source, a power that can amplify our thoughts and our intentions.
That's one way to look at it. And it leads us to, I think, the most interesting and maybe the most challenging part of Jack's theory, the idea that we aren't just passive observers in reality. We're active participants in creating it.
Okay, now my head is really spinning. We've gone from fields and energy levels to universal consciousness and the power of thought. How do we begin to understand this? How do we apply it to our own lives?
Now that is the question, and it's a question we're going to explore in our last segment. So stick around because we're going to get, well, really personal with Jack's unified field.
So we're back, and I gotta say, my head is still spinning from all this, these mind-blowing ideas. Fields, universal consciousness, the idea that our thoughts could actually influence reality, it's a lot. But now, I think we need to get practical. What does all this mean for us, in our everyday lives?
Well, that's really the key question, isn't it? Because Jack's unified field, it's not just some abstract theory about how the universe works, It's more like an invitation, I think, to look at our own lives a little differently.
So not just understanding the ideas, but really like internalizing them, seeing how they connect to our own experiences.
Yeah, exactly. Remember how Jack talks about expanding consciousness by encountering those adjacent fields? That could be, well, anything, really, anything that pushes you outside your comfort zone.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
Sure, it could be traveling to a new country, learning a new skill, even having a deep conversation with someone who has totally different beliefs.
So it's about actively seeking out experiences that make you question, that challenge you to see the world differently.
Exactly. Anything that stretches your perception, that makes you confront the unknown.
Okay, I get that. But what about magical field theory? I mean, I'm still wrapping my head around this idea that our thoughts can actually have an impact on reality. Does Jack tell us how to use this power?
Well, he doesn't give us like a step-by-step guide to magical thinking or anything like that, but he does say that we need to pay more attention to our thoughts, our intentions, even our emotions.
Okay, so be more mindful.
Right, and he suggests that, by focusing our attention, by cultivating a more positive, more expansive mindset, we can create a kind of harmony, a resonance with that general field, that universal consciousness.
So it's not about just wishing for things to happen, it's about aligning our actions and our thoughts with our deepest desires, with our intentions.
That's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that we're not just, passive observers in this whole cosmic dance. We're active participants.
Yeah.
And our thoughts, our beliefs, our choices, they all play a role in shaping our reality.
That's a pretty powerful idea, but also kind of, I don't know, a little scary. I mean, if our thoughts have that much power, doesn't that mean we have to be like really careful about what we focus on, what we choose to believe in?
Absolutely. In Jack's theory, it's not about, ignoring the hard stuff, the challenges in life.
Mm.
It's about recognizing that we have a choice in how we react, obviously, the world. We can focus on, fear and limitation, or we can choose to focus on love, on growth, on possibility.
So it's about like taking responsibility for our own reality, recognizing that we have the power to shape it through our choices, our actions, our thoughts.
Exactly. And that takes us back to, I think, one of the most profound ideas in Jack's theory, the idea that we're all connected to this vast web of consciousness, this general field.
It's a pretty humbling thought, to realize that we're not just these isolated individuals, but
Huh.
part of something so much bigger.
It really is humbling and also, I think, incredibly empowering. Because if we're all connected on that level, then everything we do, every choice, every thought, it has an impact.
So we have a responsibility to use that power wisely.
Exactly. That ripple effect, it can go both ways, positive or negative. It all depends on, well, on the choices we make.
So Jack's unified field, it's not just some theory about the universe. It's like a call to action, to live more consciously, more intentionally, to be aware of our connection to everything around us.
I like that, a call to action. It's like Jack's given us the tools, the framework, and now it's up to each of us to figure out what to do with them, what we want to build.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot to think about.
It really is. Jack's unified field, it's not some, set of rules or anything. It's a starting point, an invitation to explore, to discover, to keep questioning and expanding our understanding.
This has been, well, I don't know what to say, incredible, really. Thank you so much for walking us through all this.
It's been a pleasure, and remember, the journey doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep expanding your own understanding of the unified field. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.